Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. Sometimes when I'm watching the Skeleton Crew, I almost forget that this is a show that takes place in the Star Wars galaxy. In a lot of ways, that's how this show is set up, right? It's about a planet that's kind of hidden from the rest of the galaxy. They're going to mysterious planets where there's pirates and other kind of societies that dwell on the fringes of the galaxy. But then in the most recent episode, spoiler alert, what many might just write off as another silly part of these kids' adventure across the galaxy kind of turns dark, with the appearance of a planet perpetually at war, full of child soldiers. Child soldiering is a tradition as old as time in the Star Wars galaxy, but this time around the depiction we see on screen almost hits a little bit too close, right? It's the execution and war crimes that kind of bother me. Child soldiering in Star Wars has been well documented ever since the earliest days of the Old Republic. The ancient Jedi and the Jedi and Sith order that followed it were famous for training children in how to use the Force as a weapon, or a tool, as the Jedi called it, and other martial skills. And this meant that at times when the galaxy was in great turmoil, when there were, humongous wars between the Jedi and the Sith, a lot of these child apprentices would turn into combatants on the battlefield. Sometimes they would be commanders and lead troops. During the last horrible days of the 7th Battle of Ruusan, the Army of Light was not only sending children to their death fighting against the legions of the Brotherhood of Darkness, many of these children were hardly even Force sensitive, and they definitely were not trained. They didn't go through the gathering. A lot of these kids didn't even have lightsabers. It was just a different time in the galaxy, I guess. The Jedi and the Republic were going through their own dark age. 1,000 years of constant battle and just depression meant that they had to cut corners. Kind of like Boeing did on the 737-8 MAX. And by the time the Clone Wars happened, you had battalions of clones being led into battle by children. Sometimes this led to disastrous consequences, like at the Battle of Ryloth or the Battle of Felucia. Just imagine being one of these unfortunate souls who has to be one of these children's first command. And scores of these child Padawan commanders during the Clone Wars would also fall during the conflict. During the horrific Battle of Jabiim, the Padawan pack consisted of several children, and they all fell in a last stand against the Separatist forces on that planet. And this was just how things were in the Star Wars galaxy. The legendary Anakin Skywalker was first blooded at the age of 9 when he got trapped inside of a Naboo starfighter and participated in a skirmish over the planet and destroyed a massive droid command ship. The funny thing is, while the Jedi were constantly discussing what their role in the galaxy was and within the Republic government, they never seemed to have time to discuss the morality and ethics of sending children into life-threatening situations like this, especially children who aren't fully mentally developed. And so I guess when the so-called moral authority and galactic police are doing it, then it should be fine for everyone else. And if you take a look at everywhere else in the galaxy, that's exactly what was happening. This galaxy was full of child combatants, unfortunately. Many of Star Wars' greatest heroes and villains started out life as child soldiers, if you think about it. Captain Phasma had killed dozens of people by the time she left her savage world of Parnassus. Jyn Erso probably also murdered dozens of people before joining the Rebel Alliance. She had been tutored by Saw Gerrera and his partisan fighters. Cassian Andor fought with the Alpha Clan on Kenari and witnessed death and destruction. Tevin Wexley's mother, who was a rebel pilot, dragged him through some of the worst battles at the end of the Galactic Civil War. And if you take a closer look at all 4 of these individuals I just mentioned, they have some severe developmental issues, which leads to a lot of problems once they become adults. These former child soldiers have problems fitting into society and either become psychopaths with very questionable morals, or they just become criminals. But what do you expect from a person who, as a child, was forced to take a life, or also had to face their own mortality when other people are trying to kill them? It's hard enough for a grown-ass man or woman to process such aggressive and terrifying scenarios. What does that do to a child? Well, the Skeleton Crew surprisingly answers that. They don't go into the nitty-gritty of the psychological trauma and damage being a child combatant does to a person in the long run. But what this show does do is take a pretty realistic and detailed view at how children are exploited in these situations. Like, if you step back from the whole, hey, we're pirates and this is fun vibe, this entire episode was super dark and I was kind of surprised by it. So in the real world, it's pretty well documented how children become soldiers. A 2004 study of child soldiers fighting for the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda found that many of these children ages 9 to 12 were abducted by these militants, and 66% of these children had dead fathers. Many of these fathers have been killed during the conflict between the LRA and the Ugandan government. At these ages, it's very easy to manipulate a child and gamify war and make it exciting for them because they don't really understand what's going on. And it becomes even easier to exploit these children if they don't have a guardian or a family or a solid father figure who can, protect them from abduction. Although, 1/3 of these child soldiers in the study did have fathers, so that didn't help even in some cases because the militia had guns and machetes. And once these kids were separated from their guardians, well, the Skeleton Crew shows us just how easy it is to manipulate children into becoming fighters. We're introduced to this piece of work, General Strix, leader of the Troiks, and take a look at how he tries to endear himself with the children by saying things that adults almost never say to kids, unless they're after something sketchy.
But on this world, we treat our children as adults. We acknowledge their strength, and we help them help themselves.
This is the perfect thing to say to kids like Fern and Wim, two very rebellious kids who were clearly not engaged in their life as students, as children on Anatin. Wim is constantly dreaming about becoming a Jedi.
I think I want to really help people, like if there's danger or something.
That's not a career. That's what safety droids are for.
And Fern is constantly playing hooky from school and riding around like a squid on that speeder bike of hers, putting JB and everyone around her in danger. General Strix sees right through these kids, and he understands how children think, and he uses that to his advantage. He understands that these kids yearn for adventure, that they desire to be talked to like adults, and so that's exactly what he does, and he manipulates them into doing something really stupid, which is fighting in this stupid conflict that has nothing to do with them at all.
You each have potential. Maybe they can be of use.
Of use how?
Train with my warriors, and we will decide if you are ready to brave the fallen sanctum.
We're not afraid.
And that's kind of the point. Fear, or the lack of it. Fear comes from experience and understanding of a situation. Having fear doesn't make you weak, it just makes you informed of what's going on. How fear affects you, well, that's kind of more important when it comes to determining whether you're weak or not, but then again, that's kind of a stupid way of looking at things like this anyway. But yeah, fear is something that a lot of kids really don't have at all, especially when dealing with combat. Most younger children are aware of the concept of death, but it isn't until you're an adolescent that you start having more complex thoughts about what death actually is, or even thinking about how it could apply to you. That's just the nature of human development, right? But the thing is, as we get older, as we experience the death of family members or people we know, we become much more aware of our own mortality, and that is when we begin to develop fear. That's also why a lot of countries recruit 18-year-old men to fight in battles, because even at that age, you don't really develop the proper responses to danger, because you're still kind of young. And when it comes to even younger children, well, they make horrifically good soldiers because that part of their brain, the fear response, is not really that well developed at all.
It'll be fine. Let's just win the battle, and he'll take us to the fallen sanctum. Are you crazy? As soon as the fighting begins, drop your weapon and follow Fern.
Wim's character is exactly what you want in a child soldier if you're some evil scumbag warlord. He's fearless, he's impulsive, and eager to prove himself. And thankfully, KB and Neil are a bit more aware of what's actually going on and keep his impulses in check. But the truth is, the way Wim acts here is very realistic. I mean, if you've ever been a 12-year-old boy yourself or have children, I mean, this is exactly how boys act at that age. It's very common. But this isn't some kind of adventure or some trial where Wim needs to prove himself. General Strix is using these kids to draw enemy fire or trigger an ambush. They're basically cannon fodder. A bunch of random kids who stumbled into his camp with no parents, no guardians to protect them at all. And on this broken world, instead of trying to return these kids back to their guardians, to their families, this evil bastard tries to exploit them. And the sad thing is, it kind of makes sense why there are so many child soldiers in the Star Wars franchise. I'm not just talking about the Jedi, but I'm talking about, a lot of these broken worlds all across the galaxy. This is a result of what Star Wars is about: war. the entire galaxy is constantly in conflict. It's the one thing that ties the entire franchise together, and no matter who's in charge, the Republic, Empire, or Separatists, there's going to be people dying and societies falling apart. Worlds like Ad Akron, unfortunately, are far more common than one thinks. And it takes a broken society for an environment where people are struggling so much that instead of treasuring children, they view them as tools or, weapons to be used in some kind of fight. This happens on worlds like Captain Phasma's home of Parnassus. This was a planet covered in radiation after a nuclear disaster. Phasma's clan were survivors of the incident, workers for the Constar Mining Corporation who abandoned the planet after the disaster. The company basically wrote off the entire operation and then claimed that the planet was inhabited so that no one could kind of go send rescue crews there and see what exactly happened. It was a huge cover-up. And so this leads to this hellish landscape in society that formed on Parnassus, where every child was a liability unless they could scavenge for food and defend the group. Then there were places like Crucible, a backwater planet in the Tion hegemony. This was a world that was pretty much forgotten by the rest of the galaxy, and so you have primitive clans fighting each other for resources and for off-world weapons. And basically on this planet, the individuals with the armies, with the manpower, were the ones who held all the power. And so if you wanted to survive, if you wanted to make your life better, you joined an armed faction and you fought in these endless wars. The only way to fight excessive amounts of violence, rape, murder, and conflict is to develop cities, states, nations, and civilizations. It's only when you begin to organize society that these more awful tendencies of man begin to decrease. Of course, you can't completely eliminate all of these tendencies, but you can create a set of checks and balances, social contracts, security systems that will basically decrease them to a very large extent. I know it's popular to not like government and institutions, and while most of these systems aren't perfect in our world, especially in the cycle we're in right now, it is clear that the more organized a group of people is, the more they have a chance to flourish beyond just meeting their most basic requirements of food, water, and shelter. There's this constant debate about whether humanity is inherently evil or good, and I think it's actually not quite as simple as that. I think a lot of people do want to do good out there, but I think it's a luxury that unfortunately a lot of very desperate and impoverished people just cannot afford. Sadly, when the most basic things we need to survive are not taken care of, desperation takes hold. And then suddenly children become not treasures that need to be spoiled and nourished, but bargaining chips, tools, and even soldiers. Then there are cases like with Finn and Jin, two children taken away from their families at very young ages. A very common theme when we discuss child combatants. They were indoctrinated into a cruel and extreme system that normalized violence and intertwined it with politics and a sense of belonging. Saw Gerrera's partisans were really just a terrorist organization. They used hit-and-run attacks to keep the Empire off balance and considered Imperial citizens and non-combatants acceptable targets. It's all about dehumanizing the other, whoever you're trying to attack. That's all about gamifying war, which is what you do when you have children involved. The same goes with Finn in the First Order. As a child, he was indoctrinated to obey orders and the chain of command and destroy the corruption that was the New Republic. From a young age, these children became killing machines and were brainwashed into doing the bidding of their malicious leader. This is unfortunately another avenue in which children can get sucked into violence. Now, I know currently, especially on TikTok and Instagram, it's become really popular to support this axis of resistance. And I know a lot of people are looking on TV and seeing what's happening to Palestinians. And I know a lot of people have their hearts in the right place, and they go out there and they start protesting and supporting organizations like Hamas. But understand that, these Palestinian militant groups like Hamas, Islamic Jihad, the two main militant groups in Gaza, have education programs and summer camps in which children are indoctrinated to kill Jews and are given weapons training. Same thing goes for the rest of the axis of resistance. Groups like Hezbollah, like a lot of Arab political parties in the Levant, are modeled directly after the Nazi party and have their own youth movement that looks exactly like the Nazi youth movement, down to the Heil Hitler kind of hand symbols. And the same thing goes for the Houthis. These are organizations that brainwash and take children and turn them into soldiers. The point is, it's not about who's right or wrong in these situations. Well, these organizations are clearly wrong, but these are very complex and broken parts of the world. And they're broken because of historical reasons, because of stupid European partition plans that were made out of just like ignorance and arrogance. And then you also have the Arabs, who are unfortunately unable to coalesce and unify and create stable nation states. So when you're a person, especially if you're a person from the West, if you're a liberal or progressive minded individual, I know you mean well when you go out there and try to support the Palestinian cause, but you really cannot look at regions like this with a Western mindset, because you're making the same mistakes that those Europeans did when they partitioned the region. The culture, the devastation, just the sheer chaos in this region makes it very, very difficult to kind of understand what the right actions are and what the right actions are not. You know, I've been to these regions a lot, and I've had friends who were very supportive of one side or another, and when they actually go there, when they go see what's happening in these regions, they're very much like these kids from Ad Aten going to Ad Akron. They have no clue what they're getting themselves into. They weren't born into this society, so they don't understand the rules and just the devastation that kind of governs these areas. You know, these children from Ad Aten are running around on Ad Akron thinking that life is a game, and they have that luxury. And that's not a luxury that people in more chaotic parts of the world can have. The sad truth is there are a lot of places in the world, there are a lot of places in the Star Wars galaxy that are just f***ed up beyond recognition. And in these places, the rules that govern things are so chaotic, or the lack of rules are so chaotic, that yes, children, the most precious parts of any society, are used as combatants and forced to kill each other. They're not even given the opportunity to grow up and have normal childhoods where they can, you know, play with toys, maybe be educated. They get damaged straight from the outset, and this creates generational trauma that will last many more generations. So if you are from the West, I understand the sentiment, but just be glad that you live in a place where kids are treasured, or, you know, treasured enough where it's really frowned upon by society to use them as martyrs or soldiers. Be glad that you're in a place where you have clean food, clean water, and everything else that people in these devastating conflict zones dream of having. You know, whether it's Syria, Lebanon, or in the Palestinian territories, these are not areas that people like us can truly understand without actually living there and seeing what's going on the ground. These are places where kids like Neil are just laughed at, or at worst, kidnapped or killed or ransomed by a bunch of armed gunsmen for saying ridiculously cute stuff like this.
This weapon still works from the old days. Its strength is what keeps us safe here.
This isn't fair. You shouldn't have to be at war all the time. See that building? On my planet, that's where my mom's job is. And when I'm done with school, the supervisor will give me a job there too.
You know, I didn't expect a child show like The Skeleton Crew to show us such a bleak and horrible world like this. And what's probably equally as impressive is the lesson that we're left off with. While Neil does have a positive impact on Hanya, a future leader of the Troik, it's pretty clear that war will continue on this planet, and unfortunately, that is the natural state of life. It's a very nihilist point of view almost, but in a lot of ways, I think Ad Aten is turning out to be a utopia when compared to all these other parts of the galaxy, whether it's, you know, the crime-ridden Port Borgo or Ad Akron. You know, the kids on Ad Aten, when they're in Kim's observatory, talk about how they believe that Alderaan is still around, so they miss the Galactic Civil War and the Clone Wars. I mean, there's something just really awesome about being able to grow up in a nice suburb, being able to ride your speeder bike around and hang out with your friends in the woods and not have to worry about bombs dropping on your head or terrorist attacks nonstop. But yeah, I guess that is what I got out of this video. Interesting, you know, I'm watching too much news right now, I think. But I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that notification button down below so you don't miss on the rest for awesome content. And as usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. I'll see you next time.